Hey, Emily, guess what I'm looking forward to?
If I had to guess, I'd say your next meal.
Well, true that. But even more than that, I'm looking forward to our annual Being Boss vacation in New Orleans.
Same. We still have a handful of tickets left. So if you've been wanting to join us on our annual Being Boss vacation in New Orleans, consider this your sign to join us for a live podcast recording, masterclasses and workshops, and an epic boss celebration, and more with me, Kathleen, and your creative peers from all over the world.
In the most magical city in the world, right?
Yes.
All right, the Being Boss vacation is happening September 26th to the 28th in New Orleans. Go to beingboss.club/NOLA for all the details.
We hope to see you there.
Hello and welcome to Being Boss.
A podcast for creative entrepreneurs. I'm Emily Thompson.
And I'm Kathleen Shannon.
I'm Hannah Jewell, and I'm doing my best to be boss. Even when I don't feel that all the time, I'm being a boss, okay?
I love
it. Today we're talking about women in history who did what they want with Hannah Jewell. As always, you can find all the tools, books, and links we reference on the show notes at www.beingboss.club.
Hey there, bosses. We know you're getting a lot of stuff done. You're checking off those to-dos and wearing a lot of hats in your creative business. But just because you can do it all doesn't mean you should. Take accounting. You know it's an essential part of your business, but becoming a self-taught accountant is only going to distract you from what you really want to be doing all day. FreshBooks Cloud Accounting will allow you to save your time and energy on administrative tasks by making keeping track of your books ridiculously easy. FreshBooks keeps your money organized with easy-to-use features like invoicing, time tracking, creating estimates, tracking expenses, late payment reminders, project collaboration, online payments, and so much more. So whether your creative career is still a side hustle or you're fully supporting yourself with your entrepreneurial endeavors, FreshBooks makes being boss a whole lot easier. Get a free 30-day trial of FreshBooks right now. Go to freshbooks.com/beingboss and enter Being Boss in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Hannah Jewell is the pop culture host on the Washington Post's video team and the author of the new book, She Caused a Riot, a book about the awesome ladies that history forgot.
Hannah, welcome to Being Boss. We are so excited to have you on the show because
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
You wrote a book called She Caused a Riot, and your publisher sent us an advance copy. We wrote a blurb like months ago. I finally got the print copy in the mail like just yesterday, and the back of it, I have to read this for our listeners. There was not much. Okay, this is on the back cover. So you all, this book is beautiful. It's bright yellow with hot pink script. The typography is, I think, the same as the Being Boss logo. I love it. And so on the back, it says, this is the only thing on the back cover. There's not a photo of you. There's no blurbs. It's this and a barcode. There was not much he could do when faced with so many well-organized vaginas seeking vengeance. What?
If that's not going to make every woman I know buy that book, I don't know what will.
That's such a thing. I feel like this is like my first book, and I was so involved in making sure everything on the inside was as I wanted it to be and letting my wonderful publisher, Sourcebooks, and their design team make it look like this. And I remember picking the quote on the back was kind of like a last minute, like, sure, put that on there. And then realizing how that's actually a huge choice to have that there. And I'm actually here at the Post, a colleague of mine is piloting a kids show, like a science kids show. And she was like, I'll at the beginning of this episode, I'll just be reading your book and then I'll come down and I'm like, yeah, awesome. And then I'm like, wait, it's got like vaginas right there. And like, it is a science show, but she was a little like, okay, we'll just show the front cover of that. But it was a way to be a little edgy on there without necessarily crossing any lines of decorum.
I feel like this book is so is so wonderfully edgy, but I'm also mad that I have to say that it's edgy.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, like, ooh, like women did science. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
But it's so fantastic. So we did get
Thank
a
you.
copy of this book several months ago. We were reading it. This has been the book that I read in the airport. Like, it's the book that, like, while I'm waiting on a flight, I'll get it out on my iPad and I'll read about a couple of women, because the book is She Caused a Riot, 100 Unknown Women Who Built Cities, Sparked Revolutions, and Massively Crushed It. And so I'll open it and read about, 5-10 women while I'm waiting on the airplane to show up or whatever it may be. And I will be laughing out loud, like super embarrassingly, like sitting there with my like hats on, all like bundled up like a hermit, just laughing at this hysterical, amazing, illuminating book that you have written and should have been written and shared with everyone 100 years ago, 500 years ago, but here it is now, and I think it's spectacular.
Thank you so much. I hope when you're laughing at it, you then hold it up and turn your iPod around and you're like, everybody, available at all bookshops. And like, people like,
I will begin doing that for sure. I will also say,
much.
since it has come out, so the Being Boss book actually came out about the same time yours did.
Yeah,
so
congratulations on yours.
Thank you very much. But I've been spending some extra time around bookstores, like scanning the shelves, just making sure. Yours is in a lot more places than ours is. It's everywhere.
Man.
I see it everywhere I go, and I love seeing it.
I shout out to my marketing team / publicist and their hustle for putting it. I think it being Women's History Month, it came out in Women's History Month in March, and it that got like Barnes and Noble to put it places. But I definitely go in. I went in a bookstore here in DC called Politics and Prose the other day, and I like didn't immediately see it. It wasn't with history, and it wasn't on like a shelf it normally was. So I was a little like sad and about to leave. And then my friend was like, "Don't be ridiculous." My like really like ballsy girlfriend, and she was like, "Oh, like." She goes up and she's like, "Excuse me, do you have this book?" And he's like, "Oh, yes, they do." And they like, she brought me over to and we found it. And I'm like, "Oh, I'm so glad it's here." And like, it's a weird new thing to be sensitive about, which now you understand as well. And it's ridiculous because you think of like getting a book out being a lifelong goal and then getting it done. And then there's this whole new set of like insecurities and doubts that you can now experience anew. But anyway.
For sure. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. What are you doing now and how did you get here, and especially here being writing this book?
Okay, yeah. It's such a strange path I think I've taken. I mean, it's not that strange, but it's not like I didn't wrestle any bears to get to my current career. But I am currently a on-camera journalist for the Washington Post's video team. We have a big video team here, but who are all swirling around me right now. But we have a new section of that video team called Creative Video, and this is where there are some sort of satire video writers and producers, as well as on-camera journalists in, for instance, science and politics, and I'm the pop culture on-camera host. So I got to, for instance, go to the Oscars, and instead of in the past, the Post might have had just a camera sitting there. In fact, I don't think we did have a video feed ever on the Oscars red carpet. Instead, they're like, sent me and my colleague Dave, who is also an on-camera guy, behind-camera guy, does everything guy. We're just squeezed into 18 inches of space on the Oscars red carpet while I like desperately screamed for celebrities to come and talk to us. And we just had like a live feed on it for like an hour, I forget how long, an hour and a half maybe. And it's a very strange experience just filling space, and it had like 500,000 views. It did pretty well, and so I do things like that, live things. I appear in like more silly, scripted, satirical things, and do some like great interviews with sort of people in entertainment. And before that, my job before this was at BuzzFeed UK in the London office, because I am both British and American. I was born in London, grew up in California, and then kind of wasn't doing a lot after college. I had studied Middle East studies as my undergrad degree, and then I was kind of for 2 years in San Francisco, just living with my friends, playing a lot of pool, doing a number of part-time jobs as a research assistant for a professor, doing weird like extra work in any movie that was shooting in the Bay Area, working with a bunch of kids at a Arab Cultural and Community Center who were recently arrived immigrants, and and writing a weird marketing blog that I didn't care about and didn't have my name on it. But they paid me $18 per post. And after a couple years, I'm like, I'm not, like, none of this is adding up to anything. So then I decided to try and go to grad school, still in the same area as my undergrad. I decided to go and do international relations and politics masters. I applied for Cambridge because I have family there. My favorite, craziest uncle lives there. And I was very interested in having that experience of like the British elite in this world that I was sort of had never seen into, and was interested in that and in studying, learning more. And right after that, I got hired as an editorial fellow, which was like a glorified intern at BuzzFeed. And while I was there, I did just everything. I did the sort of basic quizzes that I'm sure you have taken, and lists and everything. I also did a small amount of reporting, and my main favorite thing to do there was making fun of both British and American politics for like a transatlantic audience, explaining ridiculous things that happened in British politics to Americans and vice versa. 2016 was a good year for that with Brexit, with the 2016 election. And then I got this book deal based on my literary agent in London. His son had seen a post I did for BuzzFeed called How to Tell Apart All the White Men in Theresa May's Cabinet, because she had released a cabinet photo with all these like men just like all just like looking like slightly red in the face and you know, looking important and looking rich. And I just thought this is an easy punching up situation, comedically speaking. And so I just like had a short humorous instruction of how to identify this person in a lineup. And I met this agent emailed me saying, do you have any book ideas? I was like, oh, yes, I have many, thinking he would be like, cool, let's meet in a couple weeks. And he was like, great, meet me tomorrow morning at this fancy private members club in London. And I was like, shit. And I went, and I don't know if this is a swearing podcast, but now it
is. Please do.
Good.
We got a big old red E next to our logo.
Perfect. So this was the idea I had. It really was an idea I had toyed with. I had written about women in history. Speaking of swearing, my first article I did about women in history for BuzzFeed was called 12 Historical Women Who Gave No Fucks. And I went and I was like, how about a book-length version of that? He was like, sounds good. And I was like, I have other ideas. He's like, nope, that's the one. And so I had just always had such a huge response whenever I wrote about women in history in the language of the internet and of millennials and of millennial women. And there was obviously a lot of interest in that and a lot of relief and people enjoying writing or learning in a way that was not, like overly somber, overly self-important. And my ability in my writing to just not take myself too seriously either, I think makes it a more of a mass appeal, more, I just don't want to like feel like you're being punished while reading this. I wrote this book in pretty much a summer between leaving BuzzFeed, when I heard from my now boss on my team at The Post, who reached out to me based on work I'd done there, seeing if I'd want to come join her here. And I was like, cool, just give me a couple months to write a book. And then I just had this crazy summer last year cranking this out. Yeah.
So obviously you're funny. You work
Thank
for
you.
BuzzFeed. I mean, this is probably
time,
I'm imagining who you are, but I'm curious about the political aspect of your career, the Cambridge, the elite. How did you maintain that sense of humor through all of that stuff? Or did you like try and even
like in spite of it?
Yeah, no, I know what you mean.
Or like, how did you keep from letting, probably the people that you're surrounded by, or how did you nurture that or cultivate it, or at least not even like dampen it down? Or did you dampen it down depending on those situations?
I think I do have a hard time being serious a lot of the time. And I got that from my mom. She's just never been a serious person. And I think that I was surrounded by, like, especially at Cambridge, a bunch of people from all over the world, young people who were learning basically and training to be diplomats for their countries and going into the most serious types of careers. And and I remember while being very academically interested in what we were studying, and I did international law, and it was such an amazing, just like mental exercise learning from this top international lawyer called Mark Weller, who's constantly had to like leave to go negotiate treaties around the world, and I loved learning about that, but I was also just like, oh, I'm just not as like professional as everyone around me. I don't have like, I'm like just late to everything, which continues to be a problem, barely able to put on clothes. And I was around these people who were like, also like wonderfully funny, warm, great people, but who just like were professional people. And while I was at Cambridge, even though I was putting in this work and studying what I was studying, I was also interested in going there because Cambridge has a very famous comedy scene from which all of the great British comedians, not all of them, but many, come through a group called the Footlights. And while I was there, I did every Tuesday night at 11 p.m., the Footlights do a show called A Smoker where everyone gets like 3 minutes to do a sketch or stand up. And I was like, I have to try this. And the first one they do each year is the Virgin Smoker. So anyone who's never done one before. So I was like, okay, my New Year's resolution for, I think, 2013 was to do 3 minutes of stand-up. And I was like, I've got all year to do it, and I have to do it. And it got to be October, and there was this opportunity. So I went and did this stand-up, and I was just like, this feels amazing. And it's not, stand-up is not the world in which I'm usually being comedic, but I definitely see that I spent my time at Cambridge learning how to make memes about our professors, like doing the kind of, like writing a column that was like a funny column about feminism. And even though my degree was in international relations, I took advantage of my time there. And as you have in any university setting, meeting the people and building skills for the thing that I was slowly realizing, I was like, actually, I just want to be a silly person. And at the end of my master's, I was applying for 2 jobs at once. I was applying to be someone's assistant at the Council on Foreign Relations, a think tank here in DC. And I was applying to be a BuzzFeed intern. And I remember just being like, what am I supposed to do with my social media presence right now? And so while applying for 2 jobs, and I was trying to make like slightly witty jokes about international relations with my like, and you have to do test posts applying for BuzzFeed, and one that I did was ranking the judges of the International Court of Justice by sexiness, because I was like, this is which I did in the library in Cambridge one day, and people were studying, and because I was learning about, international law, and I was just like, look at these, like, I don't even remember how many justices there are, but like either 9 or 11 or something, just, serious people, and just poking fun at them, and like in a kind of positive way. Ended up being like the type of humor that got me this gig at BuzzFeed, which sort of led to everything else. So yeah, I think that it was sort of like a realization that was not a sad realization. And it's like, oh, like if I had to be awake really early every day, or if I just, if I couldn't crack jokes in diplomatic settings, like it's that being okay and just staying me.
But then I also wonder if you could have, like, I could imagine you having that job and then still being funny. I wonder what that would have been, like the inverse of what you're doing now.
Yeah.
Like what it would have been like in the parallel world. But anyway,
it's
let's
totally
keep going.
possible. If I got that other job, it's totally possible. And
or you've been fired real fast.
Or I've been fired real fast. And I've been like, that's fair. That's fair. So...
All right, I want to talk about writing this book. I would love to hear a little bit about the process of writing it, because I imagine with 100 women from history in this book, a lot of research went into it. And because it was, written obviously in a very new and different voice than probably any of these women have ever, or any woman maybe has ever been written about, there was a lot of like synthesizing that information into like how it is you wanted to tell those stories. So tell me a little bit about that process.
Oh man, yeah, it was a lot of research, and there was more time, I think, researching each woman than actually writing about each woman. And because I learned I just built the muscles required to be able to write them really quickly. For researching, there's definitely very different levels of research throughout the book, and you can kind of tell when you're reading, you're like, oh, I found like one short article about this woman being the only thing that's been written about her, and writing about that, versus like, oh, I read like the biographies and I'm like so invested, and the way that I synthesized was to hand write my research notes, because I felt like if I was going to just type, if I was going to be copy and pasting from articles for quotes and things, and it was going to go overboard. So by handwriting in notebooks, I limited myself to like a few pages of the key points that I wanted to hit, with references to wherever I wanted to pull quotes from or whatever I was doing. And I just would go into the British Library in London, and you're not allowed to take pens in there, and you can order a bunch of books of the women I was reading about that day, pencil my notes in my little notebook, and then go home. And I'm definitely like a creepy night writer, and after everyone's gone to bed, and then like me and the cat in the house that I was staying in at the time would just stay up while I would look at my notes, think like, what is the like essence of what was impressive about this woman, or what was the anecdote from their life that I think is surprising and unexpected for a woman of her time, or a woman of today's time. And yeah, that it was a lot, and it was a very fearful process of like, what if there's a lot of stress about historiography and about the debates within history about the same things, and knowing, and my boyfriend's a historian professionally, and his friends who have become my friends over the last 5-something years are people who study a specific thing incredibly deeply, and I was there trying to do the opposite of that, of doing the whole world and all of time in a shallow manner. And I really benefited from being able to reach out to them and bless them, and they're all in my acknowledgements, and my acknowledgements are very long because I got so much help from people where I was like, here, I've written about a few women in the part of the world or the time that you study. Can you, a very serious, intelligent, genius, academic person, read this and just make sure that I haven't missed the point, make sure that I haven't fallen into any traps, like someone who checked my section on a Mexican nun who's amazing, Sor Juana, if you've got to her chapter yet. He was like, oh, there's a lot of a debate in the people who write about this time and place about not overly romanticizing the Aztec Empire, because I think I had made a sort of throwaway comment about how advanced and wondrous this civilization was in a way that was like true, but also is sort of an old way of writing about something. So all these little traps that are everywhere, that I was just desperately like emailing people to make sure that I was avoiding these things, not interpreting things the wrong way, simplifying things in ways that were too simplifying, even when I'm trying to write something that's between 500 and 2,000 words per woman, and then coming to terms with the fact that it couldn't be perfect, and this could never be perfect. I could never hit every single point, and I just knew going into this, it's going to be something wrong in this, and I'm just going to have to deal with that, and learning to love my book as an imperfect thing. Which is to say, I've only had like one like footnote that I now am going to delete and reprint. So that's been the only like issue. So yeah, it was the research was like crazy and sometimes very stressful, but just the sheer amount of what I had to do in a short amount of time, but also made it easy to write, to have so much material to draw from for most of the women, or a very little amount of information to draw from, and then having to fill in the blanks with like dumb jokes. So, which you can tell when you're going through the chapters, when it's like, okay, I didn't have a lot of information here. Sometimes I would address that and be like, there's not a lot known, there's debate about this, so let's just tell a story based on this assumption or that assumption.
So I'd like to know then, after going through all of that research and handwriting all of those notes and all of those things, why this book? Why was this the book that you wanted to write? And why 100 unknown women presented with great humor?
I had always seen, when I'd written about women in history, how joyfully people reacted to learning about new women in history, as I felt in myself whenever I have just out in the world heard about a woman I've never heard of, whether be it in a random tweet or in a weird Wikipedia spiral at night, and just knowing that there's so much satisfaction that I, as a young woman, got from learning about women who had overcome incredible odds to do amazing things and to do so without caring what people thought, and just feeling there's so much inspiration to be taken from women like that. So I wanted to have this book, and I wanted it to be an inspirational thing, and that's sort of probably a cliche thing, but I know that's what a lot of the reaction has been to it, and with a political message inherent in it, that all of these women were defying norms of their day that are often unresolved to this day, and wanting to build a body of evidence that the women have not just only just started to be revolutionary and brilliant in their field and the first to do this and the first to do that. I think that if you realize, oh, women have always been there and women have always been incredible in so many different ways, in whichever way most relates to what you want to do in the world, then it just feels like, oh, you realize that the problem is one of the historical record and of the way that has been shaped by millennia of patriarchy, and not about, the problem isn't women themselves, the problem isn't that women have only just been like, ooh, now I'm going to be scrappy and I'm going to lean in. I think that, not that I don't, I definitely yell lean in this book a lot in all caps, usually when a woman has just, murdered someone to gain power. And I'm like, lean in, Empress, which is, within that, I like, other than it being a fun thing to write, I also, in the times I reference lean in this book, is always to also critique the way that there's just so much pressure on women to be you can do anything with the right attitude, and it's just like, sometimes I just don't want to have the right attitude. I just want people around me to be less terrible, and that being like, I don't know. So I wanted it to be accessible, and I wanted it to be fun so that people actually would read it. And then my wondrous publisher also made it look very pretty, and that makes it a lot easier to read when there's a beautiful pastel pink or green or something on each page. And I had no idea that it was going to look like this, and they sent me the proofs, and I just was going through this PDF like, holy shit, look how beautiful it is, and showing it to people. So I want to secretly galvanize people in a political sense, and I think people sometimes celebrate women's history as if it were apolitical, but the women I chose in this book are not people like Margaret Thatcher, who appears in so many of these books, whose policies were just unquestionably bad for women. I wanted to hold my women to a higher standard. It isn't just a question of like, I'm a woman who succeeded against all odds, except for the ancient women who could just kill freely, and that was good enough for me.
I was about to say, there's several there who killed children and
they did. It was a different time. I definitely, the more modern, the point, so I have this section called Women with Impressive Kill Counts that I sometimes get asked about, and part of that, the purpose of that section really is just to undo assumptions about women being docile, women being unable or unwilling to take power, and being too soft and maternal and this and that, and the fact that these are the women who would have worn the equivalent of 80s power suits in their day.
They were showing up and playing the game,
right
along with their male counterparts.
And it's just a thing that what is funny about this section is that it is unexpected, and that we celebrate and have statues commemorating men who are as murderous, if not far more murderous, than these women. So, people really can take exception to that section. But I had a cutoff of the Russian Revolution, of the last time a woman was able to kill another woman and be in my book in a way that is considered funny and harmless. I have a woman who assassinates a czar. And after that, they're all, I think, blood-free? That's like a thing I should know. Maybe not. Easter Rising, Constance Markovitz definitely shot at some policemen, but it was unclear if the bullets hit. But anyway,
So I love that you say that you held your women to this standard. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious to hear, like, did you have to whittle it down to 100? Were you grasping for 100? And then whenever it comes to the 100, have you noticed any patterns or themes of like what they all have in common?
Mm-hmm. I think I was both whittling down and adding as I went along. adding women when I found one woman's story led to another's that I wasn't aware of before, adding just by virtue of reading so much and just coming across new names. Excuse me. And then whittling down when I found out that a woman, for instance, was a eugenicist or like wrote a love letter to Hitler and a lot of early social workers. It turns out, and women who on the surface of it, you sort of read about and you're like, wow, this woman made a birth control clinic in like the 20s and 30s and how amazing. And then you look into it further and you're like, oh, they did that because they thought like poor women shouldn't be allowed to have children, and then believed in a master race and wrote a love letter to Hitler. And so things like that I was whittling down. If someone, and adding and subtracting and then selling on my 100 when I was just like, there needs to be a line drawn at a certain point and I need to be done. Or just sort of running out of just not having the sources that I wanted to be able to do that, to be able to write about a woman confidently. What was the other part of what they have in common?
Mm-hmm.
I think what they have in common is that they were all principled in some way or another, or ambitious. And this sounds like overly simplistic, but they did what they wanted to do, in the sense that they were just doing what they were passionate about and not doing what was expected of them. That sounds really like basic and cliche, but it was something that struck me so much while going through that if a woman wasn't, meant to be a pianist, but like loved playing the fucking piano and so just did, or women who were interested in astronomy. These I have a lot of astronomers in here. A lot, I mean two. And were doing it because they loved their work. And so that was a thing that I took away was that although the title is She Caused a Riot, but that doesn't mean that they were all literally like causing riots in the streets, though some women were considered to be causing riots by having an opinion that they expressed, in small ways, just doing the smallest things that might feel perfectly normal and acceptable, but were shocking in their day to the powers that be around them. So yeah, I think many of them had networks of women that they were within or benefiting from, be it other women in their field, other activists, other suffragists, other abolitionists that they were consorting with. And for instance, Ida B. Wells is in here. She's one of the better known women in my book. She had a huge network of abolitionist suffragists who were African Americans and who supported her publication. They basically held a big fundraising gala to publish her book on lynching, which was a huge work that defined the way that we study and think about lynching to this day. This was in the 1890s, and she had all sorts of women, in fact, some who appear elsewhere in the book, who turned out for this big fundraising event for her. With the scientists, with and with writers writing to each other, with talking to other women. Whenever women start talking to other women, things happen. And so
yes,
that was a thing I absolutely was noticing throughout. And of course, what they all have in common was men being threatened by their power and women being threatened by their power, and whoever was really invested in the norms of their day being unhappy about what they were doing, be it like doing math or fomenting a revolution, with equal panic towards each type of activity.
This Being Boss episode is brought to you by 2020, where creative minds get authentic, real-world stock photos. Are you tired of coming across stock photos that misrepresent women's identity and truly lack in diversity when looking for new content for your creative projects? 2020 lets you buy millions of authentic, real-world photos proven to increase the brand image of your business. And they have a very notorious Real Women photo collection. Today, they're offering listeners of Being Boss a 5-photo free trial. To start yours right now, go to 2020.com/beingboss. That's the word 20, then 20.com/beingboss to get 5 free photos. I'm curious to hear, Hannah, is there anyone in this book that especially inspired you? Like if you have a patron saint of this book, or, you know, like one story that you really want to highlight that our listeners should hear about as well, what would that be? Or who would that be, rather?
I think I usually get asked who my favorite woman is in the book, and I can never really decide because I love them all equally. All my mothers, my 100 mothers. And there's some stories that I just love because they're so preposterous. But someone asked me just, you know, like after a book event I did in a bar, someone I don't know that well was like, who do you have the most spiritual connection with? I'm like, oh my God, I don't know. And then I think a story that
Which one were you in a past life?
In a past life. Oh man, it's so hard because I really carefully thought about who I wanted in each one. I think the women I admire the most are the women in my section, which is women who punch Nazis, metaphorically, but also not. And the women I chose in this section were women who really could have easily not done anything during World War II and really could have easily stood by as genocide occurred, but instead risked their lives and often died because they were so aware of injustices that were not directed against them personally. But that sort of courage, I think, is the part of the book where I'm like, okay, I will be serious here, obviously, and I think about them all the time. But really a woman who I just like, if I could go and meet, maybe as a way of thinking about it, is Gladys Bentley, who, I mean, I mentioned piano playing earlier, but she was a musician in the Harlem Renaissance, and in the 20s and 30s in New York was a drag king who, I have a quote I can read you. This is like a quote I keep thinking about because she was basically like the piano player to so many of the great musicians who came out of that period. And the poet Langston Hughes described how she performed. And he said she could play the piano all night long, literally all night, without stopping, from 10 in the evening until dawn, with scarcely a break between the notes, sliding from one song to another. And I just like the abandon of that is something that just I would love, like, I would have loved to be there and see people just doing their craft and what they're passionate about. And she would wear these like white tuxedos. She broke all the rules of what was expected of a woman in her time. And I like, my mom's a piano teacher too, and so I have never quite learned to play with total abandon, but because she's like a classical musician, and I'm worse at jazz because I'm like, but there's nothing set out. But every now and then when you get into a certain flow, and it's just the best feeling in the world. So I think she would like do these ridiculous like naughty word play that she would just tell preposterous stories that were like sexual and like, which actually kind of like seem like tame by today's standard. I was like, wow, she sounds raunchy. The police would shut down the club she performed in because of the immorality of what was happening there. But then I read what that was, and it was like, she mentioned masturbation, and everyone's like, oh, it's the 20s. And what's sad about her story is that as time went on, in the 50s, in the era of McCarthyism and the you know, anti-gay hysteria of the 50s, and she was a lesbian, she kind of retreated from her persona. She was always nostalgic for the way that she used to have this amazing menswear style. She may or may not have married a man, may or may not have married a woman before, not in a legal sense, but having had a ceremony. And she kind of then disavowed her previous life of amazing white tuxedo, top hat, jazz life. But she always apparently, this is one where her story's a little murkier towards the end, had kept a picture of the woman who she may or may not have married in her house for the rest of her life. But that was a story where you realize that it's easy to assume, oh, things just get more progressive, open-minded, tolerant as time goes on. But that's really not a guarantee. And that change only happens if there is active fighting against it, and societies can become more regressive as easily as they can become more progressive. And that was also a big fascination in my Nazis chapter. how do
I was
these
about to say,
societies fall to
speaking
fascism?
Of,
Yeah.
I feel like
Speaking
speaking
of.
of punching Nazis in the face and people freaking out about, progression, did that really give you some context or inspiration toward what's happening now? Did it give you, in some ways I would think like, okay, this has always been a thing, like it was never great. It was never perfect. It was, it's also getting better, but also maybe not. Like if you read, what kind of context did it give you for today?
I definitely am very fascinated by who does or does not resist bad things happening. But more so than that, who finds ways to separate themselves from bad things. There's one of the women who's in my book because of this essay of hers. Dorothy Thompson was a journalist who used to broadcast basically American propaganda radio shows into Nazi Germany. And she was really despised by the Nazis because of this. And she wrote an essay called, I think the essay is called Who Goes Nazi? And it's about her being at a dinner party and looking at around a room and in America in the 30s and imagining who would or wouldn't, if the US were overrun with fascism, if it came down to it, if they were the way that France had been invaded, if Americans had to make those sorts of decisions, how do you know who would and wouldn't go Nazi? And she goes through, and it's about how ways in which it's not as obvious as you might think, and everyone likes to think, I would never have, if I were there, I would have done this or that. And so what was the original question? Now I'm just thinking about Dorothy Thompson and Who Goes Nazi.
No, I love that you're going down that train of thought. It was just like, did studying any of these women give you some context for what's happening today?
Okay, yeah.
So you were there.
Yeah, I think pretty simply, yes, it has, especially because people are there. There's always the rule in which people bring up Hitler at any given moment, or fascism and accusations of fascism being thrown around. So I was really interested in like, what can we learn about what is the cultural context, the sort of your average person, as opposed to political leaders who would just sell out to wherever, and those leaders who pretended to be great opponents of Trump and then were immediately turning up at his overcooked steak dinners begging to be part of his cabinet. I won't name names. Not so much that, but at a more generic level of just your average person, and the way that things become normalized, the way that the small, slow steps of how societies can change over time. And I think it's a thing that people are really aware of and are teaching themselves about right now, the ways that this has happened in the past. And there's always something to be learned from the past about the present in any of these eras. And it's a thing I think about a lot.
Well, and I would even talk about how this may have affected you personally. Like, I can only imagine that diving into the lives and histories of all of these like amazing women probably shifted the way you think about the world and maybe even move through it a little bit. And I think more pointedly, has it helped you give less fucks?
Yes, I think it has. I think it's changed. There were definitely, all of the women in this book die in the end. There's no living women in this book. And I actually included the circumstances of their death a lot of the time in a way that I didn't even realize I was making a choice. Because I think a lot of books like this, you're like, they did this, and then they reached their career peak. When really there's a lot to learn about the ends of their lives and if they ended up being ostracized or whatever. So there's a lot of sadness in this book. And as I said, I write in the depths of the night. There was sort of like, sadly like crying on a cat with my laptop being like, no one understood her. But I think that in terms of giving fucks, I think that the process of becoming confident enough to put a book into the world was my version of learning how to do that, both being inspired by these women's stories, but also just knowing that, if things don't go well, if something's not perfect, just like nobody dies. Unlike some of these women's work or their activism, their revolutionary fervor often led them to being killed, and just like the comfort that comes from like, I mean, you never know, I'm gonna jinx it now, knock on wood, but like if I fuck up at my job, like nobody dies. So unless I really like put the worst video in the world that somehow kills someone, that is a nice comfort to hold on to. And I think that I am a more chill person with that understanding that with a huge task like writing a book that is 100,000 words long, knowing like I'm gonna get it done and just not to stress about it too much. And as a very like stressy, in high school, I was just like, if I don't get this score on this test, like my life is ruined forever. And I think I've just sort of grown up enough to be like, it'll be fine. I just have to be me and trust in myself, and I probably won't kill anyone in the process. And that is such a blessing. Until I do. So
I have a question about like the unknown aspect of these women. So you're highlighting a lot of women that many of us have never heard of. And our listeners are mostly creative entrepreneurs or aspiring creatives. And I think that in this day and age with Instagram and reality TV, I feel like this need for like recognition and attention and all the likes goes hand in hand with the idea of success whenever it comes to doing the work. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on doing the work and doing great things, even if at the end of your death, nobody really kind of knows who you are.
Yeah. Oh man, we're all gonna die alone. No,
we're all going to die. This is my
fine.
mantra.
The thing where was it Bridge to Terabithia, where you're supposed to learn? No. What's the book where they drink from the well and live forever, and that turns out to be a bad thing? I'm mixing up my like middle school books.
What is?
They made a movie, Tuck Everlasting. Tuck Everlasting.
Yes. Yep.
So living forever is bad. That's what I learned from that. But anyway, I think that a thing that I learned, not even as much from like the women in this book, but I learned so much after being an intern at BuzzFeed. I was then the person who hired and trained the new generations of interns. And when I was doing that, when I was hiring at BuzzFeed, I realized that the most important thing someone could do and show you in their resume was that they were already doing the thing that they were telling you they wanted to do. And women, even if they just had like I have a beauty blog, or like I review random like chicken restaurants around London because I was hiring there, and seeing that like they actually enjoy and love the thing they do enough that they're just found a way to do it. And because it is 2018 and we can make videos on our phones, we can write and post it in places that can be seen anywhere. Anyone who just had a blog that they wrote in regularly, you knew that they weren't bullshitting about wanting to be a writer. And that's the thing that I think I have sometimes, fallen in the trap of being like, well, why would I write a thing if like no one's going to see it? I'm just going to put it here. But usually I've found, without even like ever setting out to become a writer or an author, I was just always kind of doing it without thinking about it as something that was adding up to anything. But it does add up. And I think that the women in this book were interested not in being a famous woman of history or someone who would be, forgotten unfairly. No one was like, well, that's not true. Some were interested in becoming legends, for which they were very judged. There is a pilot, Jean Batten, who was a New Zealand pilot who moved to London. And her mom's goal was for her to become world famous. And she got a lot of shit for that. People were like, she's so vain. She used to always wear great lipstick when she would arrive places. And so people suspected her motives in a way that like most great, quote unquote, great men of history also imagined that they would become legends and go down in history. So women should be a goal.
Hear that, haters?
Yeah. Hear that?
Whenever you're leaving us shit comments.
It's just, yeah.
It's not working.
But I think the thing for like most of these women was that they were doing something because they loved to do it, like Gladys and her piano, or the activists in this book, or the writers in this book, and the scientists in this book, or the ancient murderesses of this book who just brazenly wanted power and were willing to do whatever it took to get it. They we're interested in doing something as opposed to being something. So there really isn't a way to, you can't promise anyone they're going to get the recognition they deserve. But I think the best chance you have of getting the recognition you deserve is that you're just doing the work, and you're just, I knew a person who was an intern who was really wanted to be like a great cultural writer, and who really just had a vision of themselves. I'm avoiding gender in any way to identify this person, but just a friend of mine told this person, you need to spend less time imagining what you can become in a world famous this or that and a widely respected this or that, and just do the work and just start a blog and just write every day, or whatever the creative thing they're interested in doing is.
Amen. Hey, I want to connect a dot really quick, because I don't know if you've noticed this. Whenever we asked you like who you would want to hang with, and you said Gladys, and you said how she just like played the piano into the night. You literally made the same motions for writing this book into the night.
Did. Yeah, I know.
So like,
That's
just
true.
in case you didn't connect that.
I did not. No.
So there you go.
It's more fun to play the
piano. You were Gladys in a past life.
Hooray! Man, I just want to. Maybe I should just go to more jazz gigs. This is actually what I'm learning about myself right now. This is the thing that I used to do this all the time, and when I lived in San Francisco. But okay, I'm gonna make it more. Apparently, this is very important to me. But it is fun. There's like a fun craziness. I mean, like a lot of the time, so painful trying to eke out a word count, and just feels like you're pulling teeth with every single sentence. But there's also the times where you're like, look at me go! Like, I'm like, this is so funny, and laughing at my own jokes, and those moments are wonderful.
I think the feeling that I most want to cultivate from this conversation is this idea of creating with abandon. Like, just really getting into that flow and enjoying the process so much. And like, even if it's not literally the most dreamiest thing you've ever done, like just letting yourself do the thing without worrying or overthinking or any of those things. I feel like, and especially our listeners, because, you know, they sell their creativity for a living. There's a lot riding on that creation. There can be a lot of weight that's put on it, and that abandon is dampered. I guess dampered is the word.
Dampened.
Dampened. Thank you.
Or I feel like there is another word, like tempered.
Tempered.
You know what? If that's not a word, you can just edit this part out.
Right? Or just keep it, guys. This is Emily
trying
to figure out the English language. Like, this is a real ongoing struggle.
Podcast with abandon. Don't let anyone keep you down.
Right? So abandon is definitely one of the things that I want to try to cultivate more of in my life, for sure. Because so many of these women, it was abandon, for sure.
And being, not trying too hard to be someone else and fit someone else's expectations. A thing that I really loved when I just started at the Post in last August, and when I started, the managing editor, one of the managing editors here, Tracy Grant, who's a wondrous woman, sits everyone who's new down and says, look, a mistake that a lot of people make when they start here is thinking that I have been hired by the Washington Post and now I have to become a Washington Post reporter or salesperson or advertising person or whatever the role is, and comes in like, wears something a little more, put together than they normally would, or speaks in a different way. And when really she's like, the reason we've hired you all is to bring what you have here. And I was so into that. I was like, even if that's just a nice thing to say, like, I love that. And it helps you. I think I was sort of looking around, and I have an amazing colleague, Libby Casey, who is our on-air politics host. And she's been a broadcaster for years, and she's just like such a professional. She's such a pro. She knows what she's doing. She knows how to, like, everything from like putting on like camera makeup within like 8 seconds somehow, and then she is so clear and is the best. And I was like, oh my God, I need to be her. I need to like mimic her voice and her everything, and then being like, well, out of love for her and as tribute to her. And then I'm like, that's not me. Like I can't. I can pretend to be a little more serious, but not that serious. And so being yourself is, again, a thing that they put on the wall in a poster in preschool, but I don't think I really knew what that meant until quite recently, I think. So
I know, I feel like the older I get, the more the cliches are really ringing so true. And I'm like, oh, that's why everyone says that.
It is. I get that.
There is something about like feeling it in your gut. Well, Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find the book?
Oh man, you can find it at Barnes and Noble. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it in independent bookstores. If it's not there in your local bookstore, go and ask for them to have it there. I'm actually about to move house to a neighborhood where the indie bookstore doesn't have my book, and I'm like, I can't live here, but I'm gonna go in and be like, if you stock my book, I'll buy it. Yeah, online you can find me on Twitter, and there's links there at HC Jewell, which is where I do most of my whining on a day-to-day basis. So,
Nice.
Awesome. And what makes you feel most boss?
oh man, I'm in such a non-boss phase, and not in a bad way. I think the moment that you feel a little too like, I'm the boss of this place, I own everyone here, it's probably a good sign that you should move to a bigger pond, or just. And so right now, I moved country, I moved to a new job at a huge, intimidating newsroom. I'm like, most of the time just be like, I'm not a boss right now, I'm just learning from everyone, and like that's fine. And I'm making a switch from writing to video. I'm just learning and absorbing and kind of being a little more timid. But I think that I've just been here long enough that I'm starting to feel like, yeah, I nailed that interview, or like, yeah, fuck you, I nailed that. And I think the thing that makes me feel boss, and I don't know if it's a bad thing or not, is being a little underestimated by someone, and then kind of seeing how their perception of you changes once you have performed your job really well. And I had this with an interview recently where I interviewed a screenwriter of a movie that I just thought was like pretty racist. The movie is Beirut. I used to live in Lebanon and for a while, and I just thought this movie was full of cliches, and I had the chance to sit down with the screenwriter, and in seeing the way his body language shifted throughout like a 20-minute interview, from being like, I'm a hotshot, like millionaire, like hugely respected in Hollywood, or at least just like very prominent in Hollywood. And I'm just like, hi, like, I'm a little girl. And then starting to question him about his choices in making this movie, which is a movie which is set in Lebanon in the Civil War, but doesn't have any Lebanese actors in it, and has a lot of stereotypes about Arabs, and I just sort of like lent into his discomfort a little and let there be silences. And after that, and like he was pissed out, like he was very nice to me after, but the PR called and was like, we expected a much lighter interview. And I'm like, well, like,
why?
You
Why
made a
did you
movie
expect
about
a
the
light
yeah.
interview?
and I get it, because it's like I do all kinds of work, and much of it is very light. But I came out of that being a sense of like, this guy hasn't been questioned in this way face to face before. He's being criticized for this movie, but he's not necessary. I think he is able to avoid it most of the time. Is a really prominent man in Hollywood in a bubble, and getting to just sort of like prick at that. I was like, I felt like a boss after that interview. And I feel like even around the newsroom, some people who were like, hey there, and I was like, that's right, I'm like starting to do things here.
I love that.
So yeah,
I have a question about that though.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like whenever I call someone out, I end up feeling, and this isn't my job as a journalist like yours, so maybe you've built up this muscle, but then I almost end up feeling bad.
Oh yeah.
Like, you know, so how did you feel bad at, like, oh man, I hope I didn't hurt that guy's feelings, but or not, or like, how do you know what I'm talking about?
I
Like
think
that
I
trying to
didn't.
like reconcile.
I think this time I think there's definitely been times when I have, and especially like even writing for my college paper, I wrote theater and arts reviews, and you're always being like, this person could have had a less terrible Irish accent. You're like, oh, there's making those comments and feeling bad about that. But in this case, I didn't, because this is a guy who just got paid millions of dollars to rewrite the last Star Wars and wrote the Bourne trilogy. Someone who has so much power and who will be fine, you know, who's that criticism is something that he might take on board, and he might listen to the people around him more and think that you have to prepare for these kinds of questions. So with him, I was like, like he'll be fine. He'll be absolutely fine. This is a person with enormous power. Whereas if someone, you know, if I was like when I was editing interns at BuzzFeed, if one of them said something that was accidentally problematic in some way, I'm just like, always thinking about like, you're new. I had my like undergrad at Berkeley, like experience of like learning about the discourse and like just, I mean, I had an intern once who applied and wrote a thing about like being a guy with like only girlfriends. And it was like, and I read through this sample that he sent me that was all like, kind of just came off as him like hating women a little. And it just like wasn't. And he asked me for feedback and I was like, you really just like were too mean about women generally being too like shrieky, this or that or the other. And what I loved was that he was like, and what I explained was like people who know you and he's like the loveliest boy who's ever lived. But people who read a thing like this might not know that you're a wonderful person in real life. And he was like, oh, wow, you're right. I hadn't thought about it that way. Was able to make edits to correct for that. And then I hired him for that reason because he could take on board criticism, but without like the judgment of like calling him out. But he was just like a young guy and an intern and that was his first job. And yeah, versus people where the power differential, especially between me and them, is vast. I just like think it's fine to yell up like, hello, like shut the fuck up.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's even like this aspect of just owning it. You know, I think that I'm always like, I'm going to say this thing and I mean it, but I don't know.
Like, do I mean it?
I hope I mean it.
Yeah. I think it's important to trust your gut with those things, but to be like, to be fair in them and to be more like kind, even if they don't deserve it. And even with the piece that ended up getting me, my book agent was making fun of some dudes, but they were literally the most powerful men in Britain. And for that reason, I didn't feel bad about making fun of their way of being in the world. So it's always depends on the context.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Kathleen. I hope that put you to ease a bit.
It's okay, Kathleen. You're going to go on Twitter later and be like, this bitch said the most fucked up things. I'll be like, no. So...
No, I love it, Hannah. It was so great getting to chat with you. The book is fantastic. All of our listeners should pick it up. It's so good. It was so nice to meet you and to hear more about your process.
Awesome. Thanks for being boss ladies and for talking to me.
Hey bosses, I want to tell you about the CEO Day Kit. The CEO Day Kit is 12 months of focused planning for your business in just one day. So Emily and I have packaged up the exact tools that we've been consistently using for years that have helped us grow from baby bosses to the CEOs of our own businesses. Gain clarity, find focus, get momentum, prioritize your time, make better decisions, and become more self-reliant with the CEO Day Kit. Go to courses.beingboss.club to learn more and see if it's a fit for you and your business.
Thank you for listening to Being Boss. If you're looking for more help in being boss of your work and life, come check out our website where you can find episode show notes, browse our archives, and access free resources like worksheets, trainings, quizzes, and more. It's all at www.beingboss.club. Do the work, be boss.